Hey, this is Karl Thomson from StorageCraft. In this webinar, I'm going to go through a quick tutorial on using the StorageCraft Cloud Services Networking functionality. So just jumping across to the portal, I'm going to select an account here and jump into the Networking tab. Now I'm just going to minimize the account details pane here just to give us a bit more room. If you are viewing this page on a small web browser, on a small laptop or screen, you may want to zoom out on the browser just to give you visibility across everything that's here. Now I always like to start explaining this by thinking about where you're going to need to use this. You need to have the discussion with your customer and say, look, in the event of a disaster, fire, flood, earthquake, some sort of disaster, where's everyone going to go? Because depending on where they go, that's going to define what type of access you're going to need to provide to their systems. So, that might be things like, are they going to go to a DR site? Is everyone going to go home? Are we going to relocate them to another branch office? That kind of thing, because that'll help you build a picture, for the greater DR plan that needs to happen for the organization. So the first thing you need to choose is the subnet. This is the private IP range that you want to use in the StorageCraft Cloud. So you've got all available IP ranges available to you. Generally, you're going to want to choose something that's different to what the customer is using on-prem. So we don't necessarily want to use the same subnet. In some instances, you might be required to. There might be applications that are pointing at particular IP addresses, and you'll try and match that. But generally, you might want an IPsec back on site, so you need to route between two different networks. Additionally, there are some challenges when you try and have the same network range. As the server boots up, it might still have the old network adapter IP tied to it and cause a conflict. So of course we can deal with all of those things, but generally you want to use a different subnet range. Now, once you've chosen your subnet, I'm actually just going to fast forward a little bit and scroll down. On this account, I've got 3 servers already replicated into this account. So what you want to do is double click on the DHCP setting here, and you can actually change it to a DHCP reservation. So I don't mind too much on that particular server. Well, actually, it's a remote desktop server. So let's look at that one as a scenario. So I'm going to set that to DHCP reservation, and we'll give it an IP of, say, .25. So 192.168.40.25, so we can save that. Now, this one here actually, this is a domain controller, DC01. So that's got a reservation of 192.168.40.20. So this is actually an Active Directory DNS server. So we actually want to put them, if you've got any Active Directory DNS servers, once you've reserved their IPs, you want to save them in the DNS server list. So what that means is as my servers start booting in the StorageCraft Cloud, they'll be given the appropriate DNS servers to resolve. Otherwise, they're going to have, a predefined gateway IP address perhaps, or some sort of DNS server that StorageCraft have provided. So you want to specify, if you are running your own DNS servers that are going to be virtualized in our cloud, you want to provide the appropriate IPs there once you've reserved them. Now, the very next step would be to request a public IP. So these do have a small monthly charge to them. You should request at least once. That will enable you to continue and set up the rest of the networking. Of course, you could do it at the time of a disaster, but it means that a lot of these settings I'm about to show you can't be configured until that time. So you might want to request at least once. You can, of course, release any if you've deciding you don't need them anymore. Once you've requested one, you want to define that as the firewall WAN IP. That will be your public IP for the gateway, and that will be used for things like the Ipsec or Open Vpn settings. So with Ipsec, that's obviously, if you're going to relocate all your staff to another site or some of them to another site, you can have your own firewall do a site-to-site VPN. It means each of those users that sit behind it don't need to all have their own VPN. Or, if you've had some sort of limited failure on site, you might want to Ipsec back on site. So depending on what's happened, Ipsec's an open standard giving you site-to-site VPN capabilities. Now basically, if I jump onto our support.storagecraft.com and jump into documentation, I just want to show you how to navigate to the settings that help you set up the Ipsec, because this does get asked quite a bit. I'm just going to scroll down to Cloud Services. Now, I appreciate that the path I'm showing you how to find this may change because our support site is going through a revamp, but just to show you the settings that we do have in place here, I'm looking for StorageCraft Cloud Networking. Here we go. So in here, we've got a bunch of the settings, and a lot of this is around settings that I'm about to show you. Some of them are around the DHCP reservations, which we've just talked about. and the port forwarding, which we're going to come to, but the VPN configuration, this is what I want to point out. We have in here documented the phase 1 and phase 2 settings. So again, this is compatible with any supported IPsec router, but you'll just need to make sure you're using the same settings to match what we have pre-configured. If this is a problem, you don't need to worry. I'm going to talk to you with options around this. Now, I have documented this. We've got a Cisco, Ubiquiti, and WatchGuard, and someone's also added in here a SonicWall. So we've got a bunch of generic router settings, step-by-step guides for various routers. This might help you with your own router following through these settings. But as I mentioned, it's around the phase 1 and phase 2 settings. So providing you've set that up, your own router should provide you sufficient troubleshooting to see why that's not working. But yeah, generally from our end, it's pretty much baked in with those settings, but I will talk more about that shortly. So just reverting back to the portal, the other option is if your staff or if the customers, the users are going to go home. If they're going to go home, we can add each person to have their own Open VPN account. So you just go to the Open VPN website and download the free VPN client, and then you save this configuration file which is used to connect the VPN. So you just add in a bunch of the users and they each have their own configuration file. Again, you can set this up in advance so that they've got the file sitting there should they ever need to initiate the DR. So those are a couple of options for your connectivity. Now scrolling down, once you've requested your public IP and configured your private IP, we've also got network mappings, or I sometimes call this port forwarding. So that remote desktop server we did, we might want to open up RD Gateway, for example. So I'm going to select the public IP here. We're going to go in here and we're going to look for I guess RD Gateway would be HTTPS. So we'll just scroll down, there's SSL there. I need to choose the public port IP, so I'm just going to map it to the same port, 443. Private IP, we're going to choose that remote desktop server, and again 443 for mapping to the same protocol as TCP. So that's how you would go in and add in port forwarding. But again, you can only do this if you've done your Dhcp reservations and you've requested at least one public IP to set that up with. So you know the remote desktop server is a really good one, because if my users are already accessing my server at night time or remotely through remote desktop gateway, all I would have to do is update that DNS record for their domain to point to the StorageCraft public IP in the event of a disaster. And once I've virtualized in the cloud, the end users don't even know their servers have just fallen over into DR mode. That just continues to work for them. So remote desktop's a really good example, but not everyone has one, and there might be other ports, websites, any other applications you want to port forward. Obviously, we've got the IPsec and Open VPN options. So very configurable. It's got a lot of options here that cater for most of our customer needs. Now, in this scenario, you need to do something more than what you can here. I appreciate that this is a fairly limited front end. We've thought of a lot of scenarios that this will cater for, but there might be a scenario where you need to add in multiple IPsec VPNs, or you need to do a bit more custom configuration. So what's actually happening here in the background is we have a virtualized Pfsense Firewall for the customer. Now you'll note here the status. The status says no router. So basically what that's telling me is the router is not currently running. This will automatically start for the very first machine you virtualize for that particular customer or cloud account, I should say. So the firewall is off by default until the first server's virtualized, then the firewall will automatically start. Now, as I was saying, in a scenario where you need to do more than what's available here in terms of configuration for the firewall, you can email support or contact your local StorageCraft account manager, and we can organize a manually configure network option to appear in your account. Now, for our partners, you only request this once and it will appear in all of your customer cloud accounts automatically once that's been enabled. So basically, by clicking this, it will revert you to the full-fledged firewall. So you're no longer using our front-end configuration in the portal. You'll need to access the Pfsense Firewall through this IP address. Now, you should note, or a lot of you will notice, that that is a private IP. So you can only access that initially via the cloud machine that you've virtualized. So you need to virtualize one or multiple machines, and on one of them, you'll then need to open up a web browser and access the Pfsense Firewall from there. Now, the first time you access that, you might like to jump into the firewall and actually whitelist perhaps your own office or IP address so that you can access this externally without having to jump in through a virtualized machine. So obviously, this is just to initially to get you into the firewall. Going forward, you've got full control to open up whatever you want to do. and it's got the default username and password that we provision on that firewall. So obviously that's why we don't open that up to the internet by default. So you'd want to change those passwords. Now, at this point, you're kind of on your own. You can use the Pfsense website. They've got a lot of documentation there. It's a pretty easy to use firewall. Our support, we'll do our best to help you, but at this point, we're kind of giving you full control to work with us on your own. Again, you can't access this until you virtualize the first server, and that firewall, obviously the router will change to, that it's now running. But again, you have to access it through that machine first to get in there, make any changes. And I had a customer that had, it was about 140 something branch offices, and they wanted an IPsec to each of them. So they came into the Pfsense firewall and put in their list of IPsec routers for the VPN, and they could actually customize that to use different phase 1 and phase 2 settings as well. Now, if you run into any difficulty or you're having problems, just simply click configure here to revert back to our portal front end instead, and that's where you've got all of these settings that we've just covered off. Now, when you're using these settings, if you make any changes once the firewall has started, it will not be reading these config settings. So what you may need to do, if you're trying to test with IPsec and you've got servers running, you can just simply click Restart Network, and that will reload the firewall. It will reread the config that you've defined in here and update itself. So that's the little sort of tip from me, is that if you're making any changes and it doesn't appear to be working, perhaps just click Restart Network to allow that firewall to reset and reload the config that you may have changed in here. Now, always saving the best to the last, we've got the virtual machine policy. Now, this is my favorite. This is actually an exclusive patent to StorageCraft. Now, as I mentioned, if you do have a small screen resolution, sometimes this policy doesn't always look the best. You may need to just zoom out in your browser to be able to see all of the functionality here. So basically, what happens is all your machines, I'm just going to delete one here, all of your machines start in the left-hand side, and basically you're going to drag them into the policy. So I've got 2 machines already in here. I'm going to drag in my remote desktop server again as I just had it. Oops, let's just try that again. And I need to put in my Shadow Protect image password. So what we're actually doing here is we're going to store that encryption key, and you're going to define a boot delay. So I'm going to put in here 240 seconds and click submit. So obviously I have to do that for each of the servers that I drag in, but what it does is it saves that information in the policy. So what I can do is say, look, this remote desktop server is dependent on my domain controller running. So now what this policy says is my domain controller is going to boot straight away. What will happen before that boots is the networking will virtualize, and then the server will start booting. Once that has started booting, these other 2 servers are going to automatically start booting 240 seconds later. So it's basically allowing my domain controller enough time to boot so that these other servers are going to log into the domain. So what that means is I've predefined my networking, I've predefined my boot order and stored the encryption key and the boot delays in there, so that I can just simply click Launch VM Policy down the bottom right, and that will invoke this policy and those servers will start booting in that order. So it's pretty cool. It's an exclusive patent to StorageCraft, saying that, providing that we've pre-configured all the networking and the servers, that we can have a one-click to fail over my network. Now, obviously, this becomes quite advantageous if you start talking 10, 20, 30 servers, because you could have quite a complex policy here saying, I want these ones running first, or these are more important, I want them to boot first, and then these ones will follow on. So, having this policy can save a lot of time, and, you kind of come up with a bit of a plan, where people are going, what people need to do, and this just enables you to have all of that laid out as part of the DR plan, so that it's very easy to invoke the DR. So folks, that's all I was going to cover off today. If you have any further sort of questions or a particular scenario, please reach out to your StorageCraft sales engineer, and we're happy to guide you through any sort of complex requirement that you might have. Thanks for your time.